Good evening. All right. So I'd like to call to order the Springfield Budget Committee. Staff, could you please call the roll?
Councilor Pitts.
Here.
Councilor Moe.
Here.
Councilor Riley.
Here.
Councilor Stair.
Here.
Councilor Woodrow.
Here.
Councilor Pictionary.
I'm here, thank you.
Luke Lundberg.
Here.
George Jesse.
Here.
Darlene Reich.
Here.
Stephen Schmunk.
Here.
Holly Shaper.
Here.
And Paul Selby.
Here.
Thanks so much. As we begin our meeting tonight, I would like to ask members of the audience who are joining us online to please keep yourselves on mute until you are called to provide public testimony. There is one time this evening designated for public testimony, and it will be listed as business from the audience on the agenda. If you are attending in person, please complete the request to speak card located at the entrance of the Jesse Main Room and give them to the budget officer. If you are joining us online with a tablet, smartphone, or computer and wish to speak during that time, please use the raise hand option to be called upon to provide comment when the designated time is announced. The order of public testimony is as follows. Anyone who is in person at City Hall, anyone who has raised their virtual hand, anyone who has submitted email in advance, and then anyone who has submitted written comment via mail in advance. So tonight it looks like we have 2 hours for questions and discussion on the budget with a 10-minute intermission. I thought based on last year we could follow that process and ask questions of each department in order of the departmental materials. And we could start by asking if anyone has questions of the department chair. And then if so, we can invite the department chair to the discussion. Does that method work for folks? All right. I'm seeing some head nods, so I'm going to say, let's go forward with that. And let's begin with the CMO then. Are there any questions for the CMO's office this evening? All right, George?
I guess mine is more of a comment, although one question, it kind of goes both with finance and city manager's office regarding what is the indirect rate being charged to enterprise funds for fiscal year 23?
Are you talking about just pertaining to the city manager's office or overall?
Well, is it different for different?
I can speak a little bit to that if you would like. It's a
Thank you.
finance question.
Yeah.
So for our indirect, we look at the cost of our central services, which is HR, finance, IT, the legal, and CMO, for any portions of them that are budgeted in the general fund. So some of those departments could have personnel that are in funds other than the general fund. We only look at the general fund, and then we divide that over the city's FTE and then charge it out accordingly. The utility funds are paying their share of that and no more. If you want specific dollars, we can dig down into those details. Is this a conceptual question or are you wanting dollars?
Well, it is conceptual, because the follow-up to that is one I mentioned last year also, and it's more a philosophical difference that I don't agree, I guess, that the city manager's office should be charging FTE directly to enterprise funds when they're also being charged an indirect rate. And my understanding is it's the assistant city manager acting as, I guess, supervisor, for lack of a better word, for Department of Public Works division managers. I guess that just seems unusual from what I've seen in other organizations. And it should be one that's, those costs in the city manager's office should be spread across the all the other funds as part of the indirect rate, in my opinion.
I can speak a little bit to that. And so I'm going to use finance as an example because it's an easier example for me to use. There is an analyst position over here, a budget analyst position, that is charged straight to the utilities. And this was a position that actually originally sat over in DPW and reported directly to the director. And when there was some turnover, we looked at that position and we decided that it could be more effective if it was a finance position embedded in the utility funds. And so essentially now it's in our budget, but it's charged to the utility funds, and it only works on utility fund issues. When I look at the rest of the finance staff that is charged as part of the indirect, the work they do touches all departments and all activities, accounts payable, procurement, whatnot. So we draw a distinction if you're working predominantly on behalf of a specific department versus working towards really the common sort of overall good of the organization. And it's when you're working towards that overall is that we spread that out on the indirect. If you are working exclusively on an activity, you're charged directly to that funding source. So that's just one position. Does that help you understand why we have that in different departments? But we go to great lengths to make sure that there's no double kind of charging.
Yeah, it does make it easier to accept on specific positions with specific tasks. When you get to something at the level of the city manager's office, I think that isn't necessarily the same. It doesn't apply the same way, because those higher level management positions tend to spread their time over. I think it would be very difficult to identify, okay, 0.15 of this FTE should be charged to sewer utility, 0.15 charged to storm utility, and so forth. I just find that difficult. And like I said, it's as much as philosophical difference as anything else. But I think it can get dangerous for those enterprise funds when we start divvying that up amongst positions like in the city manager's office or HR or along those lines.
Yeah.
But
So
yeah,
I'm just going to pop in really quick,
Sure.
Nathan. And in my over 20 years in government, I have seen, different agencies and organizations have different ways to allocate costs throughout the department. When it comes to whether it be a city manager's office or a county administrator's office, I've been in both situations. It's not uncommon, and in both types of organizations, they have utility funds that do pay allocated costs. I've heard this in different contexts around different types of funds. But really, it's a justifiable and not uncommon expense at all. In fact, I haven't seen a situation where you would exclude, in the example that you're referring to, Mr. Jesse. I think in the case of the assistant city manager position, I wanted to make a conscious choice to provide that position with direct reports. It's an important part of succession planning. And I think it's just a good overall experience, but I can tell you that, and we do spend quite a lot of time on issues that relate directly to these enterprise funds, especially with a lot of the development and planning that's occurring in the city. So I'd be happy to talk more with you offline if you want to set up some time to go over that.
sure. Thank you.
Are there any other questions for the city manager's office? I have a couple if nobody else does. Checking one more time. All right, so I had a couple from the presentation. I noticed that a stated fiscal year 22 accomplishment was around DEI work. And so I was wondering, so diversity, equity, and inclusion work. I was wondering whether the internal diversity committee was involved in any of the hiring practices at the city. So for example, the upcoming search for the management analyst, the ARPA project manager, all of those open positions that we heard about last week. And additionally, was this internal diversity committee consulted prior to the permanent appointment of the police chief? considering that was also a fiscal year 22 accomplishment.
I was on unmuted and I didn't realize it. Our diversity, and actually the name of our internal diversity committee, it used to be called the Committee for Diversity and Inclusion. It is now called I want to make sure it's called IDEA. And so it's Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Access. So that they just made a change in that. So I want to make sure I'm using the appropriate name for the committee. I have talked to, they meet I think they meet every other month. Myself and the assistant city manager go to every single one of those internal meetings. I don't ordinarily, when it comes to making a decision on a hiring, it depends on who is making that decision. So let me take, for example, the ARPA projects manager. That wouldn't that was a limited duration position. The individual that was selected for that position had long-term facilities knowledge of the city. He had worked on the city buildings in different iterations of remodels. So it was more a question of, we had a small window of time to push out the ARPA projects and a specialized skill set. So that was a different type of hiring process. And our HR director is here, and he can talk a little bit about how we have incorporated the diversity, equity, the idea, I still have to get used to it myself, the idea committee in city processes. I know that they are definitely involved in looking at language. So for instance, they were heavily involved in updating the city's website to add diversity specific language about the types of applicants that should be selected to apply. I met with the IDEA leadership I guess it was last week, and we're talking to them about, so we haven't had a chance to talk about this in the committee yet, because I just talked to them about the IDEA committee being forming a subcommittee to look at recruitment language, to use more specific language that really draws out what we're trying to accomplish in the city. So right now we do have words that people in the diversity, equity, and inclusion field would recognize. We use words like, hey, belonging and working on a team. But I was talking to the IDEA committee, and we all kind of agreed that we could be stronger in that language. And so I believe probably at our next meeting, we will discuss how we could work with our HR department to be more deliberate about not only the language that we use on our recruitments, but also in the hiring process as well, and making sure that we really draw out specific language, talking about communities of color, talking about different forms of diversity and what somebody's actual experience in that area is, rather than saying, for example, like, how do you work on a team? That it's an important question, but it doesn't necessarily get to the heart of the issue. And we all kind of agreed that we could shore that up.
Thank you. That's really good information. Thanks for the name of the committee as well. In all of the presentations, it was just the Internal Diversity Committee, so I didn't know the name of it. I have a follow-up question to that, or I guess it's more of a statement. I wanted to ask or mention that it's really nice to see the city prioritizing this type of recruitment. However, I'm also wondering if that trickles up. So if it's prioritizing recruitment of a diverse workforce for leadership positions, as well as in like entry-level staff positions, so that there's diversity all the way through the organization for true organizational shift. And then if there's anything other than additional trainings that are planned, like traditional DEI trainings, like is there policy change coming? Are there things that are more substantive for this DEI work as it moves forward?
Yeah, so those are good questions, Chair Schaefer, and I'm going to let, in a second here, I'm going to let our HR Director, Shane Hertz, talk a little bit about his process, because he has a very prescriptive process that he goes to when he analyzes the entirety of the workforce in the city. And I think we've made some good momentum and some strides on that. And yes, I would say there is the IDEA committee forms their own strategic plan. And so they recently completed that and adopted some new bylaws. And so I think that this committee has really, I'm really impressed with how they have grown in not just their composition, but the scope of the work that they are wanting to tackle in the city. And I'm very supportive of that. Shane, do you have can you give just a quick update on how you do your process of looking at how we compare to our city and our employee base?
I could try.
It's not a quick answer, but
it's not a quick answer. I will tell you that I've been here for 5 years. It has been a point of emphasis during the 5 years that I've been here. I've studied the history of the city with regards to diversity. I have data that tracks back to the initial affirmative action program that the city did have at one point and then moved away, I think somewhere in 2005. I don't have the exact dates in front of me. I've also been part of the diversity committee as a de facto representative from the executive team since I've been here. When I first started, Michelle Lewis was the president and was really kind of the initial person who really pushed this program along. And she's departed from the organization, but handed it off into good hands. It's an active committee with growing participation in members. It is still a volunteer program, which means people, we do pay them and we try to schedule the meetings while it's on the clock, but they're really doing work not only on their own time, but their off time as it relates to the community outreach. And their emphasis has been primarily around kind of the community's connection to the city, as well as the cultural connection within the city, and not so much on recruitment. But I have pre-pandemic, I think they have a sub team that I worked with for about a 6-month time frame, who reviewed our hiring processes and gave us some recommendations that we've adopted within our hiring process. And we look at the committee as kind of an additional voice and an external ear to kind of help make sure that we're making adjustments and doing the right things. And so they're kind of a check and balance, but they're not a decision maker and they're not actively involved in the individual hirings that happen within the city. We have multiple regulations that we try to follow within that. One of those is veteran preference. And so when we look at underrepresented parts of our workforce and trying to provide preferential hiring, we have to kind of balance that with our requirement with regards to veteran preference points. But what I've been trying to do since I've been here is to just put visual data in front of our executive team on a regular basis and keep the conversation flowing. And during the time that I've been here, we've moved our diversity, which had historically sat around 7.5%, and we're now around 11.5%, and hopefully continuing to grow. We have a very robust database of people that we announce our positions to. I think it's around 38 different organizations around the community that we use as resources to help promote opportunities within our city. And we continue to try to figure out, if it's language, how do we make corrections to that? If it's the visual representation or the community reputation that Springfield is primarily a white dominant workplace, which is true. But how do they see us as a warm and receptive place to work for all individuals? And so there have been a number of activities that the diversity committee IDEA has done prior to that name of bringing diverse communities into our city and into City Hall. And a lot of that has helped. And we've also looked at leveraging in particular niche areas like our apprenticeship program, ways to bring in that committee's feedback into our selection decisions. So that's my brief response to this. But as I said, it's about really being mindful of our selection process and kind of our preconceived biases that we have that we don't often recognize that influence sometimes our decision making, and trying to make those changes. We have not sat at the HR level though and outlined our strategic initiatives that we want to take into the next fiscal year as far as the real specific items that we're going to tackle over the next year. And one of those things I'm playing with really is more of a diversity and inclusion policy, to be a little bit more explicit. But there's some strategic pieces that I have to kind of figure out how to play with, and how to decide who decides what that language is going to look like.
So thank you, Shane. Just one quick wrapping up on while we're on the topic. I'm instituting within the performance evaluations of our executive team members a metric for them to report out on what they are doing to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion in their department, because I think that what is measured is maintained, and it shows an emphasis there. 2 weeks ago, I was at the Government Alliance on Race and Equity Conference in Portland, made a lot of really great contacts there, got some great ideas, and actually got I had sent an email to one of the presenters because I was so impressed with the way he described equity, and thought that could be a potential framework for the city, but I wanted to explore more with him if that was something he would be willing to do. And of course, it's never easy. He's out of Berkeley, but he was really, really impressive. And I think that we have a lot to do, but just because we have a lot doesn't mean we can't keep going and can't keep doing it. I don't want perfect to be the enemy of good. So I think I'm very proud of the work of our IDEA committee. And I think they just do a tremendous amount of good for the city.
And Nancy, I'm just going to add one piece that I left off, if you don't mind, just real quickly, which is one of the activities that took on just pre-pandemic was a mentorship program primarily targeting gender as an opportunity for leadership positions. And that was something that was really developed by Michelle, and then went its full duration and was very successful in helping connect people who didn't otherwise see themselves as leaders and recognize their capabilities to be leaders in the organization. It was a really well done program.
Thank you so much. That was very in depth. Are there any additional questions for either Nancy or Chaim right now? Seeing none, can we move to the Department of Public Works? Are there folks who have questions for the Department of Public Works?
This is Darlene. When I was listening to the presentation, I heard a lot of comments from Tom Boyd, I think, about climate change mandates, and if these are coming down from the state or what, but could he mention maybe a couple of these mandates that they're going to have to deal with? Is he there, or can you hear me?
Yes, I'm slowly coming into focus. They had to, the way you get put as a panelist takes a moment. The mayor can help me out with this at any point. The big one is called the Climate Friendly Equitable Communities Rule. And it's been referred to as sort of a game changer in Oregon land use planning. It started as direction from the governor through executive order to her state agency directors. It's really centered at the Department of Land Conservation and Development. They're the folks who oversee the Oregon land use planning program. It's being targeted for our land use plans, our zoning, and our transportation plans. Related to that is also a requirement to pick up the scenario planning effort, looking at different scenarios to reduce greenhouse gas production on a per capita basis, even as the community grows. The city was involved in scenario planning in the late, sort of around 2010, was not required to adopt any of those outcomes. The state is requiring us to pick up that work with Eugene and Urban Lane County. The rules are a little more prescriptive this time. And as we go through regional land use and transportation plan scenarios, we're going to be trying to figure out which dials can get turned to bring greenhouse gas production down. But it's fairly prescriptive. And then I'd say the other big one, and I did mention the mayor, so I should probably get out of the way here, but the other big one was called House Bill 2001, and that's where the middle housing requirements came from. We are putting middle housing into our development code right now as part of an ongoing development code update. But there are significant follow-on housing analyses and reporting requirements that will track this for, easily the next 10 years. So it's kind of a 1-2 whammy. We could provide you with a lot of information, Darlene. I know the mayor has provided oral comments and written comments to the Land Conservation and Development Commission. The city has a pretty well staked out position working with League of Oregon Cities and Association of Oregon Counties and several of the other there are about 11 metro areas in the state by this certain metric. So working with those folks. But I don't have it all at my fingertips. Our star transportation planner, Emma Newman, working with Assistant City Attorney Christina Kraz, has been representing the city exceedingly well. But this is as significant as the transportation planning rule amendments in Goal 12 transportation, which occurred in the early 90s and then kind of drove the land use program for 20 years after that. This takes it all to the next level.
Mayor Van Gordon, did you have something topical to this?
I guess wanted to add from a budget committee perspective that the headwinds from a regulatory perspective are significant. And to give you insight with how much the number I have heard thrown around from places like Bend that would be that we're estimating that if the rules as they are adopted today would be like $5 to $6 million for them to implement. Like, I don't think we have an estimate yet. But the amount of housing work and climate work and planning work that is coming down at the city, as it's outlined in the memo, is a significant amount of work and is probably the biggest land use change since the 70s. So for what it's worth, we're giving comments back. I'm talking to other elected officials to try to make, sure that our opinion is sort of heard and included in the current rulemaking process.
George, did you have a question?
Just to follow up on that, if you wanted, I actually downloaded something. There was a link. I don't know if you can see this. Probably not. There was a link in the budget document to this climate friendly and equitable communities rulemaking. And it prints out on 2 pages, gives the names of the people that are on that committee, rulemaking advisory committee, which includes representatives from Springfield, Eugene, Lane County, and so forth, and touches on the cities that are impacted and some of the main targets. I guess the one thing we can recognize, and I think the citizens need to, is that reduced driving is going to be one of those things. So Public Works is impacted greatly by that, because we're going to see probably less emphasis on roadway or street improvements and more towards buses, bikes, walking, and so forth. That's what I take from reading this, and I don't know if Public Works has the same opinion on that or not.
I would say it's definitely a big part of it. Parking reduction, it's the operating theory is that you can control what comes out of the tailpipe by organizing your land uses differently and providing alternatives to automobile travel. Fairly theoretical.
Yeah.
Do you think the change in the governorship will help with some of this stuff, or is it in cement? I've heard about what they want to do on River Road, and most everybody I've talked to it is opposed to taking out lanes of traffic and put in buses that only 5 or 6 people are riding.
Can I just jump in for just a minute before Tom answers? I understand our budget committee members' intent behind the question, but as staff, we're prohibited from engaging around any kind of candidate-based discussion. So we try to keep our discussion to the issues. Thank you.
So I was going to defer the political question to the mayor, actually.
And Darlene, like, I think that's a longer conversation, but like, as everybody here who votes takes into account, right, like voting choices who we vote for ends up impacting policy. So without getting into the details of the politics of it, I would just encourage people to vote.
George, did you have another question?
Oh, I actually have several questions about Public Works, but I don't want to be the only one. So maybe I'll do one and then give other people a chance to ask questions too. So the first one I've got is, when is Mill Street going to be paved or improved? Is it fiscal year 23, fiscal year 24, 25, somewhere down the road? 2 years, no, in 2019, I was told it was going to happen in 2021, after a lot of the utility work had been completed in there, which it was, and it's still in terrible shape.
So I would recommend to call up City Engineer Jeff Pascal. What I will say, I guess, not really in our own defense, but to explain the calendar, is that intergovernmental agreement took us well over a year simply to process through ODOT, Oregon Department of Transportation. So it's a federal aid project, and we lost about a year and a half just getting to the starting line. I don't know if you're able to bring Jeff up. I know he's here tonight.
I believe he's here.
Okay.
Yep, I'm here, Tom.
All right. Yeah. Passing off the scheduling
Okay.
for Mill Street to you, Jeff.
So to start with, the early 2025, we're just starting the planning
Jeff,
process.
I'm so sorry. We're having a hard time hearing you. It's pretty choppy.
Must be your connection.
Okay, might be my question. Is it getting any better?
That seems a bit better, yes.
Okay. Yeah, weird internet connection. Anyway, as Tom was explaining, we lost quite a bit of time. The original plan that you heard was what we had planned for, what we had budgeted for, and we had received funding to do. However, given the requirements for federal aid projects and working with ODOT, and the fact that the city is not
He's breaking up again.
We just lost you again, Jeff.
I might have to try a different connection.
Is this something that we could, I think maybe we can do a short answer, Tom, and maybe we could maybe send.
Bring it back.
It could be a
Yeah.
follow-up.
Yeah, I think the bottom line is we're heading into design and we're getting ready to go. And it's a long awaited project. It's a big project for Springfield. It's a full depth reconstruction. You may have noticed the street's pretty well lost.
Yes, I have noticed. Okay. If somebody else wants to ask questions of Public Work, go ahead. I might have another later.
Are there any other questions for the Department of Public Works? George, I think if you have questions, you should just go for it.
Okay, thank you. There is one about, gosh, now where I could find it. Oh, a comment in the Public Works future considerations for city right-of-way tree infill. And I think maybe the mayor is very interested in tree infill too, from what I've read. One comment I want to make is, please don't plant trees that are going to grow into power lines and communication lines. I live close to Aspen Street, and City of Springfield, Lane County is constantly there trimming trees every year to prevent future damage. And it just seems like by planting trees under there, we're building future maintenance costs into it that are unnecessary. So that's a comment I got on that one. And I don't know if any of the plans for the infill takes that into consideration or not.
You want an answer to that, George?
Well, if, I guess, do they take that into consideration? Don't plant trees that are going to grow into the power lines.
Sorry, Nathan, I could.
Oh, we'll bring Brian Conlon up. If
There you go.
give us a moment.
Should be coming on.
You're up.
Hey, good evening, Budget Committee members and Chair Holly Schaefer. Great question, and really a frustrating point for us, Mr. Jesse. For years, we've struggled with our public trees and wires and trying to maintain them properly and dealing with frustrated citizens. And one of our associate managers, Ben Gibson, has reinstituted and put more priority in tree removals, in fact, that are in the public right of way. And much attention has gone towards the species of tree we're replanting. So when we remove a tree, we're trying to replace a tree as immediate as possible. So to answer your question simply, yes, it's very much in play. In fact, I think we've had too many trees in some areas where we've reduced numbers and added trees in others that have needed it, and provide shading and frankly helps with our environmental interests around greenhouse.
Okay, thank you.
The plan is to continue a more robust removal and replanting. So more prioritization on the city street tree, urban street trees.
Okay. I'll let others ask or follow up.
Sean, did you have something you wanted to?
Yeah, so I had, when I review the actual document, over the overview, I didn't see, could you talk a little bit about the priority for gateway planning in there? I didn't see it called out, and maybe I missed it in the, sort of fiscal year 23 considerations, or like the 3-year considerations, which, obviously that urban, bringing that land into the urban growth boundary and getting it ready to develop is going to be a critical part for the city.
That's going to be Tom Boyott. And I believe he's still here.
Yes, I'm still here. I'm struggling a little bit with the question, Mayor.
So I didn't see the gateway, the North Gateway area from a planning perspective called out with all the additional priorities. And I don't know if it was sort of intended, like we've got so much going on. I don't know if it was intended to be folded in, with other planning efforts, or if it was missed, or right, like it just, with all the big ticket items, it's not, I didn't find it anywhere, and I may have missed it.
Right. It's not on this list. We most recently, I think that's, in part due to the volume and the priorities that are in front of us that council has asked us to work on. The whole climate friendly equitable communities thing kind of hit us for a turn. We spent a number of years trying to find the dollars from our federal programs to pay for that complex planning effort. It's a fairly significantly complicated intersection at Gateway Beltline with the relationship to the freeway and all of the work that ODOT's put into I-5 and some of the constraints that the city has left with. We are working now, as the council knows, doing the natural inventory in North Gateway and South Mill Race area. Again, this past year had a traffic engineering and planning firm take a look at what it would take to amend the Gateway Refinement Plan and the Transportation System Plan to urbanize North Gateway.
Right.
Right now, it's being held in agricultural overlay zone. Significant effort, even more than I was already worried about. All of that said, we're not leaving it alone by any means. We think about it, we talk about it, and we also are in conversations with property owners out there and their representatives, and looking at what it would take to make that an urban use, to do the planning so that we could get the state's buy-in to have North Gateway brought into urban zoning and put into production for urban land uses. It's a heavy lift.
Yeah, I know. That's why I was looking for it, right? Like, I know there's a lot to do, and we're probably best case scenario 5 years away. But it's something that we obviously got to keep moving forward on.
Yeah, and it never, it may not be on this list, but it never leaves the list in my head, if that helps. And we are doing some work right now with the property owners' representatives on just trying to map out what it's going to take.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
You bet.
Councilor Pictionary.
Thank you. I'd like to just bring a point of order that there's been many discussions regarding policy decisions, and that's not within the purview of this committee, and that we only have a certain amount of time. And I'm trying to, if I can, ask that the chair bring us back on track to what the charge of the committee is.
Okay, Councilor Pictionary, thank you for that. Nathan, can you speak to the... I'm not sure where we've gotten off track into policy. And so Nathan, I would look to you for that.
It's not an easy answer because a lot of these issues have budgetary impacts. So I think, when it started veering kind of the politics of the governor, Nancy had stepped up and said, hey, this is not something we can talk about in this discussion. Right now, I understand a lot of this feels almost policy-like, but I think it's just also helpful for people to understand how it's impacting us budgetarily. Councilor Pictionary, if you want to speak to anything specifically that you feel has crossed that line, please do.
Well, we're talking about our policies regarding planting trees and how tall they should be. It's a good question. It's great for curiosity, but this is a budget committee, and that doesn't have budgetary impact in my mind.
I'm sorry, Councilor Pictionary. I do know that the tree planting was part of an initiative planned for the next fiscal year, so I can understand why that question came forward from George Jesse. But again, I'll defer to staff as to whether or not that crossed the line into policy.
Yeah, I thought it was probably fair games. It's identified in the operations division as an activity they're doing. Obviously, it does have budget implications. But
Just
I
to,
think they answered it reasonably well. I just wanted to bring up, that I see that as a long-term maintenance problem if we're planting trees that are going to impact communication and power lines. I have similar concerns with some of the activities we do about pavement restoration. I mean, frankly, there's a number of roads that are in poor condition throughout Springfield. And it seems like what I read in the budget document, there's lots of planning, administration, studies going on, and less actual repairs or restoration that happens. So I have a concern. I feel it's, should be brought up, and maybe more steps can be done to actually get work done rather than analysis.
so I just wanted, if I can quickly just get us maybe back a little bit on a policy question versus a budgetary question. It is accurate to say that tree planting has budgetary implications. Asking a question about a species of trees or awareness of how high a tree would grow does get into more of an administration question. And I think it's always a balance when you're having these meetings, because we have a long agenda to get through with all of our departments. And I want to make sure that every department has an opportunity to answer questions with respect to Mr. Jesse's questions about streets being repaired or versus planning. I think when we get to talking to operations, Brian Conlon can talk about that, and Tom Boyott as well. We are actually on track with all of our street bond projects, and I thought we have done a lot of communication around that, but maybe we could do better. So we'll make note of that when that department comes up, but it would be helpful to try to move forward so we can get all of our departments through in the time that we have allotted.
And I'm just to add to it, to just ask people to be mindful as you ask questions, to think about the impact that it is having, budgetarily, and try to keep it to that confine. And then also, as we have these evenings scheduled out, if we run out of time, it's going to take a majority vote to extend either an evening or to move into the fourth evening. So keep that in mind as well as you ask questions.
Thank you. Are there any other questions for the Department of Public Works? I'm not seeing any. I will mention that we are fast approaching the 1 hour mark. And so I was going to offer the 10-minute intermission now, and then we reconvene and resume questions with department chairs after that 10-minute intermission. All right. Any objections? Okay, let's be on break. See you in 10 minutes. I think it's been about 10 minutes. I don't know if everyone is back. It looks like most are. All right. Why don't we get started with library so that we can just make sure that anyone who has questions for her has time to ask them. Does anybody have questions for the library? I'm not seeing, oh, yep, sorry, Councilor Pitts. It looks like you have a question.
Good evening. So I guess my question is, I know a few months ago that you all implemented the no fines, and I'm wondering, has that been implemented and how that has affected revenue, whether it's from books not being returned, period, and so you end up losing the ability for people to check out the books, or any money that came from fines was used to do something. Yeah.
Good evening. So I'm Emily David, Director of the Library and the Museum, and thank you, Councilor Pitts. Yes, we have, well, actually, we haven't been collecting fines for over 2 years because we didn't collect fines during COVID at all, but that now has become the policy that was approved by the City Council. I don't, last year, I think we made about $12,000, or the last time we reported it was about $12,000 in fines. So I can't tell you that we've noticed any sort of difference in as far as money coming in or books being lost. We haven't seen a dramatic change in the way people are using the library, other than that people are very pleased to find out that they no longer have to pay fines when their books are a little bit late. So we do have some books that, you know, we're still trying to collect from during the COVID period. We still have people that are coming back to the library for the first time in over 2 years. So, but we are starting to, you know, keep track of things that have been out for a long time and trying to track those items down. So it's still pretty new to have any real information or statistics to report yet, but we'll be keeping track of that, and we'll be happy to report out after we've, you know, been through about, you know, at least 6 months to a year of time without the fines, if that's helpful.
Thanks so much. Are there any other questions for Emily? All right, I'm not seeing any, so thank you so much. I think switching over to finance, are there any questions for the finance department? George Jesse?
Well, I'm sure I'll have another unpopular one here. It's more a comment. It's about the ARPA funds. I guess in my opinion, I think these should be used for short-term needs that don't require future funding sources to be continued. And it seems like a number of positions are being plugged into the budget for fiscal year 23 that have, from what I understand, 1 year of funding. And then they're going to have to compete at that time with other general fund requirements. And I think it's more appropriate that those compete at the time that they're implemented for general fund requirements. And those ARPA funds, which I think could be well spent on a number of maintenance items down the road that have been identified for facilities, for roads, for lots of improvements around the city, one-time expenses rather than something that obligates an FTE for consideration down the road. And I don't know if anybody, if finance is the appropriate one to comment on that, or each department that has a position that was identified utilizing ARPA funds.
So I think the mayor would like to speak to this topic.
Yeah, so George, good question. But this is something we discussed through with at council when we prioritized the ARPA funds to begin with, and when we kind of got the policy briefing about it, you know, we got the additional guidelines attached to it. So like the ARPA positions that got added into it were essentially those pros and cons. Like that's really coming from the council at this point. It's not a staff decision. It's more, we looked at our needs and said, hey, program this money and go from there. Now, I think you do bring up that one-time consideration question. That's really good, but like that, we hashed through this already.
Thank you. Are there any additional questions for finance department tonight for Nathan? Seeing none. Oh, sorry. Luke, I'm sorry, I didn't see you.
No problem. I'm just sitting here looking at the active funds, and in the active programs, we see the where did it go here? The municipal court services have essentially, tripled, almost quadrupled in the last 4 years. I'm just trying to make sure that I'm reading that right, and what is causing such a significant increase in those costs?
I don't know if you are reading it right. You could give me the page you're looking at, but
I'm on page 118 of 218, active programs, financial summary by program, program 1200.
Okay, and what I could tell you is we're actually consolidating programs to make our accounting structure more easy to implement. And so what was spread out amongst many programs has now been consolidated into a single program. That's why that has increased, but what you're not seeing are all the programs that previously had budget that have gone away.
Okay, but I mean, the overall program total has still over doubled, 2.5 over that period of time. So there still are significant increases in all active programs. So is that shifting from inactive to active?
It's inactivating. I'd have to look at that page specifically, but I can tell you that the cost of courts hasn't doubled or tripled over that time. It's inflated with the rest of the city.
Yeah, it's a normal inflationary rate.
So I think it is just reading that page.
Yeah, and this is more of a comment just for, I mean, I won't be here next year, but in the past, as we've seen more breakdown in those funds, so that way we can see exactly what has gone up and what has shifted and the significant, I mean, how much of a increase it has been in the past. Is I really appreciated that, is having that breakdown by the program funds, is seeing here's what this fund is and why it's going up so significantly.
Yeah, so I'm looking at that page, and if you go down to the active programs, you see how there's budget in 2021 down in some of those inactive programs.
Yeah.
That amount,
so that's the shift.
it's showing down there and not up above. We'd have to manually go in there and pull it up and add it to it, and it just makes it labor intensive.
Yeah, no, that's fine. That's not a problem. But yeah, okay, thank you.
Thank you. Are there any additional questions for Nathan tonight? All right, seeing none. Are there any questions for fire and life safety? Not seeing anyone raise hands for questions with fire and life safety. All right, moving to human resources. Are there questions for human resources? If no one else has questions for human resources, I do.
Takes just a second to get your name up.
Yep, no worries. Hello. Again, I had a question about your pie chart in the HR presentation around the racial diversity of the city. I noticed that it seems to be missing people who are more than one race. And I'm curious if the city tracks that as the census does, or if that was just an oversight and it just got missed.
No, we have our PeopleSoft tool has some limitations. We're still trying to get it up to speed. One of the other items that we're still missing is those that don't have a gender designation that we're trying to get adjusted within our system. So currently we don't have that option of being able to select one or more races, and that's why it's not showing on the chart.
Okay, do you know, so that's something, it sounds like that's something you're working on fixing in the future?
It's, yeah, well, it's not really in my controller scope. It's an IT related item. It's an issue that I've pushed up through the IT PeopleSoft team as a project that needs to get addressed. I don't have a timeline or a date for when that will get looked at.
Okay, thank you. And then I had a question about the stated performance measures for the department. The diversity percent of minorities employed at the city is performance measure 4. I noticed the target is 14.8%, which I believe was from a link to a census overview or snapshot. I found a similar census table, however, it had a lot more detail, and it looked more like a 20.2% community diversity as opposed to 14.8%. And so I was just going to encourage maybe looking at that data again
Yeah, so I saw that in the question that you brought forward, and I was looking at that, and I'll probably need somebody with a little better expertise on the data point. It's hard for me to tell which data point is more accurate. Is it 14 points, 8 or 5 or whatever that number is, or is it 21 point something? And that has to do with understanding how the one or more races is getting calculated into the other calculation. And so I plan to do some research and try to figure out what the correct answer is. But I did catch that after your question was presented.
Great, and I think you might want to actually look at the ethnicity category and how that's being calculated into the other races. The one or more races, it's calculated, they're not included in the single race categories. So if that's helpful.
That is helpful.
And then I just have one other question, and it's about the liability insurance that you mentioned. And I'm wondering if the per claim deductible is remaining constant this year, if you know, or if it's escalating as stipulated in the packet last year.
I don't have an answer. I don't know if Tom McGleston is on and could answer that specific question. Is he available?
He is on. We'll try to bring him up.
Okay.
Hi, good evening. Yeah, to answer your question, our deductibles are staying the same.
That was short and sweet, Tom. Appreciate that.
That's good.
If I could add just a little bit of context, we have, and I want to recognize Tom and Shane both for their really hard work in this effort, instituting an enterprise risk management program throughout the city, looking at areas of risk, identifying the likelihood of risk, of that risk occurring and what the impact of that risk would be, and trying to look at mitigating strategies around that. We remain in very close communication with our insurance carrier around personnel decisions, anything that might adversely impact our rating. So it's kind of like I would use the analogy of if you're driving your car and you get like a lot of tickets, you know, it usually takes about 3 years to clear those off your record. I personally have an excellent driving record, but you know, so it's kind of like that. You have to have a better, they have to see that experience level actually in reality going down and sustained going down for a period of time before you see a corresponding reduction. And I hope that will come to fruition. And I feel good about the relationship that we have with our carrier.
Yeah, thank you, Nancy, and I appreciate the acknowledgement. You know, I think Tom and I have been very blessed with an engaged leadership group that has really worked hard to address the topics that we've brought to their attention. Chief Shearer's done an amazing job of really leading some really core areas in some difficult times. And so we've really appreciated the engagement of the work. We've come a long ways, and we continue to try to take steps forward in mitigating risk. I was just involved in a conversation earlier today around cybersecurity, which is another high risk item that's impacting communities in our area. And so we're trying to make sure we're taking active steps to keep us insurable with the requirements that are associated with those items. But it's a big team that works really hard to make sure that we're spending dollars in a way that supports the community in the best way possible and minimizing the risk and liabilities associated with it. So we've come a long ways over the last 3 or 4 years.
Thank you so much. Just another quick check to see if anybody else has questions for CHAIM or Human Resources. All right, thank you. Does anybody have questions for information technology, IT? Seeing none. Does anybody have questions for the City Attorney's Office? No? Okay, seeing none. Does anybody have questions for the Police Department? Councilor Pictionary, and I think we'll bring up Chief Shearer.
Thank you, Holly. Just a quick question, Chief. I know that you budgeted in a new position through the ARPA funds, I think, for a deputy chief. And I know that in the command structure, at least correct me if I'm wrong, that you have some lieutenants, and I assume you did some serious consideration regarding, instead of that position, but creating a captain position, and you obviously chose that deputy chief position. Can you kind of articulate, because it's probably going to be a little more expensive that way, but can you articulate your reasoning behind that?
Let me, before Chief Shearer answers, let me jump in, because actually, Councilor Pictionary, that was me that
okay,
that requested that be put in the budget. And you're our law enforcement expert on the council, so you probably know those distinctions far better than a deputy chief versus a captain versus a lieutenant. Right. I wanted, we haven't, this obviously the position hasn't been approved, okay. And I want Chief Shearer to weigh in on this, but it was probably more my trying to describe what that position would do without maybe the level of precision that you would have as a law enforcement expert. But I would hope that also, I do know that we need an executive level position in the police department. From my opinion, I believe that the chief has been very, very busy with a lot of administrative things, and which is great. He's instilled a lot of change, but he needs to be able to be in the community, interfacing with that community. I know he does that now, but this would help him be able to do that. I believe in the past, the city did have a deputy chief position. I did ask about that, and I'll leave over to Chief Shearer.
Yeah, don't get me wrong, and same thing, Chief, is that I concur that there's definitely a vacuum in the executive level in the agency, and if it's too early in the game to be asking these type of questions too, I understand that. I just thought it was kind of going to be passed with this budget, and if that was going to be the case, and I wanted to kind of get a little more information before I was really comfortable with it. But so if it's not a done deal and there's room for discussion down the road, or at least a phone call to fill me in or whatever, I'd appreciate it. And it's not a huge deal. I just wanted to know what type of consideration was made to make that leap, because there is a leap there.
So I can weigh in now to kind of talk about the difference, or is that something you wanted to offline, so I'm clear?
You talking to me or Nancy?
I think it would probably be more of an offline question. I think the overall goal is I'm trying to work on succession planning throughout the city overall, and knowing that we have, just like a lot of other agencies, a number of positions that could be within retirement stages. But in this particular case, it was really me trying to identify what I saw as a gap, and some assistance in the police department. We really, when you could look at a comparable organization, we don't have a lot. We're lean all over. I think I say this all the time, so it should be no surprise to anyone. So maybe an offline discussion about that would be helpful.
I'm fine with that. I just wanted to have the background is all. Okay, I'm good.
Are there any other questions for the police chief? All right, seeing none, I do have a couple of questions if nobody else does right now. I was wondering, this is kind of a combination question. So in the HR presentation, there was discussion about a lack of women employed by the city. So, you know, we're sitting a bit low at employing 31% or 31% of city employees being women. And part of the citation for that, or part of the issue, was that there are male dominant industries that are playing into that. And one of those named was police. And so I wanted to ask about whether our police department has signed on to the 30 by 30 pledge, which is trying to increase the number of women in policing to try to help with that lack of gender diversity, I guess, in that field.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Holly. I just recently became aware of that program, and it's something I think that's very interesting. I can't say we've signed on to it, but the low numbers of female applicants in police work is a challenge that I think every agency is facing, and that program has merit. It's something we're definitely going to be looking into, but at this point we have not signed on to it because it's something we've just recently started looking at.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I just have a couple of additional questions. One was, I noticed that the computer forensics program no longer has funding this year, and I was wondering if you could speak to that.
I'm going to defer to Jess Crawford on that, and that's not accurate. I think it's probably just a reallocation into some different funds. In fact, we've expanded our computer forensics and added a second person, largely due to the number of child exploitation cases that are going uninvestigated in the state of Oregon and the county. So that's a high priority for us. We've actually expanded that unit, but as far as the dollar figures in that fund, I'm going to have to defer to Jess.
Hi there. Yeah, actually, that is just a reallocation similar to what finance was experiencing in the court. We're just trying to simplify our coding and better reflect it. So that was folded into the detectives program because they are a detective. So.
Thank you. And then, sorry, I'm wondering if you can speak to whether there's a dedicated funding source for naloxone purchase and administration. I couldn't find anything in the budget itself.
Again, we talked about that the other day, and to date, I think we've been getting our naloxone given to us, and I can't remember the name of the organization that gave it to us. Jess knows, but that's something we have not had to pay for, is my understanding to date.
Thank you. And finally, sorry, the performance measure targets on the final page of the department pages, I got a little bit confused since it had the actuals for calendar year 22, and I wasn't sure if that means the actuals up until like now, so just the first couple of months of 2022, or if those are actuals for calendar year of 21 and the targets are for 22.
That's a great question because calendar year 2022 is not finished yet. So I'm assuming that might be a typo. It should say 21. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. All right. Thank you. That makes a lot more sense. I was confused.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions for the police chief? Luke?
I'm just looking at the allocation of the FTE, and it looks like between 21 and 22 is the limited time that was spent on the Cahoots program that was removed. So is that folded into another program, that FTE, or was it just they were doing that as a secondary job and it just got removed clerically?
Clerical correction, yes.
Okay.
So what it previously represented was some time allocated by a particular sergeant that did it part-time. It was an estimate of 5% of their effort, and it we still do it we actually probably spend more time on that, but it wasn't something that was accurately reflected. And so really it's just kind of a special assignment as assigned to whether it's an administrator or a management individual. So.
Mhm. And then I guess I just have another question about cahoots, and because I'm not sure if I missed it in here, but it doesn't seem like was as much discussion this year about the cahoots program being featured with the police as there has been in the past. I know from past years that we're eventually coming up to the point of having to fully fund cahoots directly. And that should have been in the next couple fiscal years. Has that situation changed at all? Or
may I, sir?
Please.
Okay. So that situation hasn't changed. So we are still at that 50-50 share of cost with Lane County through a grant support that is through this next fiscal year. And then, so beginning next year, we have some real discussion and funding decisions to make in that regard.
Okay. And then not to get too much into the policy of it, but that seems like something that even as a stopgap, the ARPA funds would be something that I think is, I mean, because cahoots is probably one of the best programs I've seen developed in recent years at any governmental level. It's just, it does exactly what is needed to remove time from the police that don't necessarily have the training to deal with that, no need to deal with that because there's services being provided that aren't necessarily law enforcement, that kind of stuff. And so I guess that's one area of the budget that I would think it's such a big concern because it's a problem that has been so well adapted into the city that we kind of just forgot almost that it's there and have taken it for granted. But next year we're going to have to come in with, and how much does the grant pay now? And how much are we looking to, how much is that program going to cost in about a year?
It is 50% of what we propose. So it's about 440,000.
Okay.
So it's significant, and it may not be as flashy and prominent maybe as prior years, but we did include it in the future year considerations and under the mental health section. It is definitely on our minds from a police department perspective and from a city management perspective as well.
Nancy, did you want to?
Yeah, thank you, Chair Shaver. Just a quick, I just want to do a little reminder. We use some ARPA dollars to help cahoots with the purchase of a second van to augment their program. So, and it's most definitely on our radar. We have until December 31st, 2024 to obligate funding for ARPA. So appreciate the reminder, and we'll definitely keep that on our radar. We do think it is an important program. It's been very vital.
Yes, thank you.
Councillor Stair?
Yeah, thank you, Holly. So I think I heard you say, Jessica, that we were sharing 50% of the budget for cahoots with the county. Is that us and Eugene jointly with the county, or is that just the city of Springfield?
It's City of Springfield services only. Eugene has their own contract specifically with Whitebird for cahoots services. The contract that we have is for City of Springfield and for the surrounding urban growth boundary. And that was the funding from Lane County is actually a grant funding managed by Lane County.
Are we pulling our weight, so to speak, per call? I mean, is our share of the call volume reflected in the amount that we're paying?
I may not understand the question, but the information that we've provided previously in regards to the number of calls for service that Cahoots provides and the service they're providing City of Springfield has been exclusively for Springfield. The City of Eugene has vans and teams that support the City of Eugene services specifically. So they although they are coming from that same Whitebird Clinic parent company, we do have separate dedicated service and teams.
Yeah, what my question was I would imagine that there are a certain amount of dispatches that Cahoots gets per year. So what I'm asking is Springfield paying an amount that is commensurate with the number of calls that are going to Springfield as opposed to the rest of Lane County?
I think this might take, I think I understand your question, Councilor Stair, which is to differentiate the origin of calls from if they're originating within the city versus originating within the urban growth boundary area. And I think I'm not, that would really, I think you'd have to analyze the dispatch logs. I don't know if that's something our police department does readily, but it's something we could potentially look into, but it really, depends on the nature of the call and where people are dispatched to.
Yeah.
Well, America has a comment too.
There is a significant difference in, we've actually just recently pulled that call information. I'll have to look it up to help Lane County understand the benefit that's being provided to individuals outside of the city limits. And so there predominantly is benefit to the city itself, and we can provide that information if you're interested.
Okay, well, my reason for this line of questioning was that I agree with Luke Lundberg that this is a very valuable resource that we've had access to, and I would hate to think that we're somehow not pulling our weight as relative to the county's funding. That's all I got. Thanks.
Mayor Van Gordon.
Just, I guess just a quick follow-up for that. Since maybe the way I think about it is if there's Cahoots calls or Cahoots hours that are on the Springfield side of the freeway, like that essentially is funding that is coming from this program. Is that right? So would it be fair to say that essentially we're getting the grant money to help fund it, but anything that happens in Springfield, the city of Springfield is essentially funding? And go ahead, Jessica.
Essentially, I think that we do have from the Springfield team more than 50% of the services that are provided, but we are definitely getting a majority of that service.
Yeah, and the other way that I kind of think about it is also the county is a healthcare, is that essentially the health department is the health board for the area. They are responsible to provide some mental health services in the city of Springfield for citizens of the city of Springfield. So to me, right, like we sound like we've got that fair balance. We don't have to sort of divide it behind, hey, look, if it's a call on county land, right, are they paying for it? It's okay for them to pay a little bit of additional share because they're responsible to provide behavioral health services, in the city limits.
Are there any additional questions for Chief Shearer or Jessica? I have one small follow-up. Looking at now that the calendar year makes more sense to me, I was wondering, I noticed that the targets for calendar year now 22, I guess, have dropped because the targets in calendar year 21 weren't met for property crime clearance and person crime clearance rates. And I'm wondering about the dropping, like the lowering of targets.
Well, I think the challenge has been largely due to staffing issues and our inability to fully staff our detective division in order to fill patrol responses. That has negatively impacted our clearance rates. No, we've still got detectives working very hard, very diligently, carrying large caseloads. We just don't have the personnel back there due to the staffing shortages.
Understandable. And so I'm guessing as you fill more personnel or have more personnel join, then those targets may increase again?
Yes, that's the idea. That's the goal.
Great, thank you. Are there any additional questions for Chief Shearer or Jessica? All right, seeing no questions. I believe that concludes all of the departments. Unless
Holly?
yes, sorry, Darlene.
Darlene, on my sheet, I have capital budget summary that I haven't checked off. Did we miss that, or is that something else?
Oh, I'm sorry, I may have missed that. So calling for any questions for the capital budget summary. George, Jesse, and I think we might need to bring, I think it's Jeff up, Jeff Pascal.
Might help
I'm
to get
not
the
sure
question, because it could be a multiple people that we may need to bring up. So let's get the question.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is directed just at capital, but it certainly can have an impact on capital budget. And it's a comment again related to Public Works about the concern for the growth in the storm and sanitary sewer funds between 21 to fiscal year 23. It's like a 29% increase in each of those. And I've spoke before council in the past too about concern for increase in sewer rates. And I'm hoping that, that we wouldn't experience that size of rate increase. I would support more of a drawdown of this ending fund balance in those funds, which seem like they're quite large at this point. So that's my comment.
Okay, I mean, I know I talked to Matt about this and I saw he popped up as well, but I can speak to the probably what you're seeing as the growth in the both stormwater and wastewater reserves. Some of that has to do with we've been in a process of designing several sewer projects, especially wastewater. And what you'll see over the next couple of years, starting actually this spring and summer, is several projects will be out to construction. We just awarded one sewer lining project, about a mile of pipe, for just under $1 million. We have another sewer extension in South 28th Street ahead of the dust mitigation paving, which you see in the capital program, that will be out this summer for construction. And then we also had stalled a little bit on completing the Jasper trunk sewer due to some wetlands concerns and needing to mitigate or figure out how to mitigate some wetlands. And we just solved that problem this last winter and spring. And so we're back to moving forward with that project and anticipate having that the phase 3 of the sewer extension out to bid. One of the things that affects us, and I know Nancy mentioned this, is just our staffing levels. When we sold the bonds, it kind of took all of our capital staff to move forward and get those bonds out, those bond projects out on the street and get those done. And we are just finishing the last one. In fact, I just signed the notice to proceed for the last bond project today. And so that construction will start here in the next month or so. And with that, our staff is now shifting back to storm and wastewater projects at full go. And so you'll start seeing us draw down on those reserves over the next couple of years as we get some very large projects out and get some rehab projects out as well, which in review of the capital improvement program, which was approved by council in January, we have 2 rehab projects that will be going out and starting design starting in FY23 as well.
I can add to that as well. Welcome, Budget Committee. This is Matt Stouter, Environmental Services Director. With respect to the rates conversation, we have been keeping a pretty close eye on that. And on the stormwater side of things, over the last 5 years, I think we averaged about a 1.9% increase. We had a 0 during the COVID year of 2020. And this most recent year was a 2.5% on the storm side that was just approved last night by council. Local wastewater is slightly higher than that on the average of about 2.5 over the past 5 years. We've been fortunate, that's quite a bit lower than the inflationary costs we've been seeing, but past actions by council and staff have positioned us really well. In addition to the capital drawdown, we're probably going to see here that Jeff spoke about on the stormwater side, especially the city accepted a new permit to discharge from DEQ last June. And there's going to be a number of increased regulatory requirements that we'll need to meet, especially on the operational side of things with respect to increased maintenance and operational function for public facilities that we own and operate and maintain.
Thank you. Darlene, did you have questions for capital?
No, I just saw that it was missed on the thing, and I'm just checking things off.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. That's helpful. Are there any additional questions for Matt or Jeff? Not seeing any questions, and so I believe that may conclude all of the departments this evening. And with that, I believe we can move to business from the audience. So as a reminder, please state your name and ward or general location and limit comments to 3 minutes. Neil, is there anybody present in City Hall?
Chair, we don't have anybody in City Hall for comment tonight. We also have no written comment as well.
Thank you. Neil, has anybody raised their hand in the Zoom webinar?
Chair, I'm checking now, but not so far. It doesn't appear so.
Maybe give it just a second. All right. Seeing no hands, I think that would conclude any business from the audience. Are there any other items or issues that anyone would like to discuss this evening? All right, I'm not seeing any requests for discussion or hands raised. So if not, then I believe we can adjourn early. So we are adjourned. Thank you.